Good evening. My name is Joseph Sippets. I'm here for the St. Joseph County Public Library, and it's time for another Saturday night story. Tonight, I will be reading from a book by Sarah Vowell called Assassination Vacation. I love the cover. Sarah Vowell, you might know as somebody who has appeared frequently on NPR's radio shows, or you might know her as the voice of Violet in the Incredibles movie. But I know her as the author of nonfiction stories of American history, and she's quite good at this and makes them very interesting to me, and I highly recommend them. We'll be reading from Assassination Vacation, which is during which she goes to visit sites associated with the assassination of three presidents, Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. And she doesn't really have chapters in her books, so I can kind of start and stop wherever I want. But actually, I think that the second half of the introduction makes for a nice standalone piece, and so I'll be reading from that. Sarah Vowell, Assassination Vacation, we begin. Okay. Somewhere on the road between museum displays of Lincoln's skull fragments and the ceramic tiles on which Garfield was gunned down and McKinley's blood-stained PJs, it occurred to me that there was a name for travel embarked upon with an agenda of venerating relics: pilgrimage. The medieval pilgrimage routes on which the Christians walked from church to commune with the innards of saints are the beginnings of the modern tourism industry, which is to say that you can draw more or less a straight line from Dark Ages peasant blistering his feet trudging to a church display displaying the Virgin Mary's dried up breast milk to me vomiting into a barf bag on a sightseeing boat heading toward the prison island hell on which some of the Lincoln assassination conspirators were locked up in 1865. I remember that my friend Jack Hitt had written a book called Off the Road, in which he retraced the old pilgrimage route from Santiago de Compostela in Spain. So I floated my pilgrimage theory to him in an email, and he wrote back that at one point on his Spanish trip, he saw, quote, the flayed skin of Jesus, the entire thing, with eye holes and stuff, mounted on a wooden frame, end quote. Cool. His email went on to say that in the Middle Ages, relics were treasured as something close to divine. Often, when a great monk had died and there was a sense that he might be canonized, the corpse was carefully guarded in the tomb for 24 hours a day. Visitors could come to the tomb. Most of the funeral vaults of potential saints had a small door, like you might have in your suburban house for cats. Visitors could poke their heads in the little door and breathe in the holy dust. Most people thought that the dust had curative powers since it was associated with a near saint whose corporal matter had been directly blessed by God. So getting near the relic, touching it, and being near it was considered extremely beneficial and treasured. Curative powers? I wondered how taking the train to Philadelphia to look at the sliver of Garfield's assassin's brain floating in a jar is supposed to fix me. There was a late Renaissance king of Spain whom I loved, Jack went on. He was so inbred and crazy, incapable of eating food and reproducing, that he was called El Hechizo, with the bewitched. He was probably special needs. After destroying the world's largest empire ever in all history and bankrupting the nation, drowning in New World gold, he came to die. Half of the College of Cardinals arrived to recite prayers over his feeble, frail body. They split a live dove over his head every morning, and they had brought with them the most powerful curative tool known to man, the putrefying, stinking, rotting corpse of St. Francis the Assisi. Then, and maybe now, the greatest saint ever. It had been in the bed next to El Hechizo, and for the rest of his days, the King of Spain shared his bed with the greatest saint relic ever, in the hopes that it would restore his health and grant him the potency to generate an heir. Neither happened, and the empire eventually dissolved into warfare with England around 1588 and became a backwater. I can relate. Not to being special needs, though it's been my experience that if you go on a historical pilgrimage while wearing your Jackass the Movie ball cap, some people look at you as if maybe you are. I crave my relics for the same reason Senior Bewitched bunked down with the late saint. We're religious. I used to share the king's faith. And while I gave up God a long time ago, I never shook the habit of wanting to believe in something better and bigger than myself. So I replaced my creed of everlasting life with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I believe in America, chants the first verse of one of my sacred texts, The Godfather. Not that I'm blind to the Psych 101 implications of trading in the martyred Jesus Christ crucified on a Good Friday for the martyred Abraham Lincoln shot on Good Friday. One thing the Spanish king's Catholicism and my rickety patriotism have in common, besides the high body count, is that both faiths can get a little ethereal and abstract. Jesus and Lincoln, Moses, Jefferson, can seem so long gone, so unbelievable, so dead. It's reassuring to be able to look at something real, something you can put in your hands, although you might want to wash them afterwards. What's that smell? Wondered the bewitched king. Actual St. Francis staining the sheets. Did a fellow as shrewd and sad and poetic and miraculous as the right man for the right job at the exact right moment as Abraham Lincoln truly walked the earth until gunned down? Well, come along on one of these We Cannot Escape History weekend escape packages, and we'll genuflect before the bone from inside the head and the hats he wore on the top of his head. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Civil War. When I really think about all of them, they seem as likely as the parting of the Red Sea. But somehow, jumping up a foot to stare at my own face framed in Lincoln Springfield's shaving mirror makes me feel far-fetched, grisly, inspiring. The story of the country seem a little more shocking and more true, especially since when I jumped up to the mirror, I set off a super loud alarm. Jack's email about the relics ended with an aside about how he had just been shopping on eBay and stumbled upon a guy selling tiny specks of George Washington's hair. Literally, these clippings were nothing more than single strands of hair, more than a quarter of an inch long. They came in little ampules with documentation. I looked away from my computer and over at the frame on my wall and wrote Jack back that my twin sister Amy had given me a teensy eyelash hair of John Brown as a Christmas present. She settled on the more affordable tresses of the abolitionist guerrilla warrior Brown because Lincoln's hair was out of her price range. This is the kind of person that I've become. The kind of person who rips open a package in snowman wrapping paper to discover that her only sibling has bought her an executed slavery hater's hair. I got her a DVD player. As I learned that morning at the bed and breakfast, while I was going on and on about the singing squeaky from, most people don't like to talk about violent historical death over muffins. I would come to find out that's also true about lunch and dinner, too. When my friend Bennett and I were trying to decide where to have brunch, he suggested a dim sum place in Chinatown. He asked me if I'd ever tried bubble tea. I said yes, that I think a better name for the tea, afloat with tapioca globules, is tea and dumplings, and that I had it at a Chinese restaurant in D.C. that used to be the boarding house where Booth and his co-conspirators met to plan the Lincoln assassination. Bennett asked, "You know the Kevin Bacon game? The one where everyone can be connected to every movie star?" "Yeah, that one. Assassinations are your Kevin Bacon. No matter what you're talking about, you always bring the conversation back to a president getting shot." He was right. An artist pal marveling at the youth of a painter in the Whitney Biennale was subject to the trivia, well, John Wilkes Booth was only 26 when he killed Lincoln. A gardener friend, bragging about his lilacs, was forced to endure a recitation of Walt Whitman's Lincoln's death poem, "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." As Johnny Cash put it about how his Garfield assassination ballot went over at Carnegie Hall in 1962, "I did Mr. Garfield, which isn't very funny if you're not in the right wavelength and nobody was. Once I knew my dead presidents, I had become insufferable. I started to censor myself. There were a lot of get togethers with friends where I didn't hear half of what was being said because I was sitting there silently chiding myself, don't bring up McKinley, don't bring up McKinley. The bright side of researching the first three presidential assassinations is that my interest is optional, a choice. One man who makes a cameo in all three stories was not so lucky. Abraham Lincoln's oldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was in close proximity of all three murders, like some kind of jinxed Zelig of Doom. The young man who wept at his father's deathbed in 1865 was only a few feet away when James A. Garfield was shot in a train station in 1881. In 1901, Robert arrived in Buffalo mere moments after William McKinley fell. Robert Todd Lincoln's status as a presidential death magnet weighed on him. Later in life, when he was asked to attend some White House function, he grumbled, "If they only knew, they wouldn't want me there." On July 2nd, 2003, the 122nd anniversary of the Garfield assassination, my friend Nicole and I rented a car and drove up to Vermont to visit Hilding, Robert Todd Lincoln's estate in Manchester. His mansion is a museum with landscaped grounds where, in the winter, there is cross-country skiing. I find it hard to stop myself from being unfair to Robert. Shown around the house, climbing this graceful staircase, a guide proudly points out that Robert himself designed it. It's impossible not to compare him with his father. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Robert Lincoln bought a nice ski lodge. The person I'm really treating unfairly is Nicole for taking her on an 8-hour round trip to Hilding. I guess learning trivia about when the colossal William Howard Taft came to visit. He slept on the floor because he was afraid that breaking the bed in Robert Lincoln's guest room isn't enough for Nicole, because at the end of the day she pronounced the trip kind of a bust. Ever polite, she hastens to add, "You brought some good snacks, though." When we returned the rental car on 34th Street, the block is crawling with people filing into a concert at the Hammersmith Ballroom. The Foo Fighters are on the marquee. I walk Nicole to the subway, hoping that she doesn't notice who's playing, because then she might remember tagging along as my +1 to a Foo Fighters show 7 years earlier when I was still making a living as a rock critic, which I fear might remind her that I was like before I went off on historical tourism deep end, when tagging along with me to work used to be fun. President Warren G. Harding, beware. The elderly Robert Lincoln was the guest of honor at the dedication ceremony at the Lincoln Memorial in 1922. Harding, also in attendance, returned to the White House unscathed. Robert died in 1926, but for the rest of his life he made a point to visit the memorial often, gazing into his father's marble eyes, saying, "Isn't it beautiful?" A pilgrimage needs a destination. For medieval Christians, that was usually a cathedral of St. James in northern Spain. This tour of the assassinations of Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley ends up in the Lincoln Memorial because that's where I'm always ending up. It's the closest thing I have to church. On the National Mall in Washington, next to the reflecting pool, that shallow rectangular pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial, the National Park Service has posted a sign. It features a picture of the protesters in the March on Washington, listening to Martin Luther King Jr. deliver his "I Have a Dream" speech from the memorial steps. The sign says, "This pool reflects more than the sky and the landscape. It mirrors the moods of America, from national celebrations to dramatic demonstrations." That reminds me of a photograph of the memorial's Lincoln sculpture that my tour guide held up at Chesterwood, Daniel Chester French's studio in the Berkshires. French obsessed for years about how to sculpt Lincoln's peculiar face, fretting and reading and thinking about before committing to the brooding, seated philosopher in the memorial. He received the commission in 1913, so by the time the memorial was finally dedicated 9 years later, the sculptor was a little pent up, worrying how his work would come off. Hoping to celebrate, French looked upon the final installation with horror. The problem in putting in a reflecting pool, the darn thing reflects. When the light off the reflecting pool bounced up into Lincoln's face, it looked as if a flashlight had been held up under his chin. The Chesterwood guide described the photo as a Halloween picture. Lincoln looks frightened, startled, confused. Edward munches The Scream by the way of Macaulay Culkin's Home Alone. Apparently, hilarious wasn't the aesthetic French had been going for. Along with architect Henry Bacon, French tinkered with the various solutions, concluding that only electric lighting placed above Lincoln's head would correct the travesty. For years, he pestered the government to pay to fix it. I'm happy for French that he lived long enough to see the ceiling lights installed so that his Lincoln is as dignified and pensive as he intended. Otherwise, the man might have died in embarrassment. But I like that picture of the panicky Abraham Lincoln. Lately, I think I might prefer it. Given that what the sign says about the reflecting pool reflecting America's moods, and given that the current mood is on an edgy side, what with all the new coffins being buried every day in Arlington Cemetery, this is 2003. Behind the statue's back, the freaked out Lincoln gaping at the current government might look a little more true. Then again, in the 1860s, at least half of the country loathed Abraham Lincoln for filling up too many soldiers' coffins, which is why Daniel Chester French isn't the only reason the marble likeness sits there on the mall. John Wilkes Booth deserves some credit, a notion that would have made him want to throw up. After all, if no one had hated Lincoln, there would be no Lincoln Memorial to see and to love. Good night.